You know, there are times when someone with your level of education comes on the show and people say, well, this is not the experience most people have, except in this particular case, in terms of the dealing with the grief and the pressures of coronavirus, it has been your experience kind of from the beginning. Your father passed in April.
Yeah, I think my father was one of the early victims, passing in early April. Although I should say at the age of 87, so there has certainly been more tragic cases during the pandemic. And my 85-year-old mother is still with us. But yeah, I've had my story. I will tell you, I hope 2020 is the year of empathy, because if anything, this teaches us that each of us really does carry our own burden.
Let's talk about dealing with these things. Your mother is dealing with the loss of your father. You wrote that there was no funeral, but she could paint and she could plant a tree. The dedication reads, Babylonica Weeping Willow in memory of Ying Kao Lee, painted in 2020. Let's just talk about how we are supposed to deal with these things. For some of us, it's actual grief of losing someone. For others, there's a feeling that experts have told me feels a lot like grief, even if you're not dealing with the death of a person, because everything you know about life has changed. And for others, it's anxiety and it's mental anguish. What can we do in these moments? We know that the end of this is coming, but it may be many months.
Yeah, I went to school to get a PhD in psychology, but sometimes I think I could have just, sat and watched my mom, and she probably would have taught me everything I needed to know. So just, my mom's story with losing my dad, they lived in the same senior retirement home. She was in independent living. He was in the highest level of care. And until he died, actually, it was her routine every day to basically, walk back and forth. I think she probably logged miles every day from her independent section to his. And then when he passed, which as happens sometimes, like very suddenly from COVID, if I just take a page out of her playbook, like how did my mother deal with that grief? There was certainly the shock. There was certainly the sadness. But I have to say, my mother's attention went very quickly to, how this was a blessing, that my father had been in a lot of pain in his final months and years. She, thought of like good memories. And then, she got out her paintbrushes, and the painting she made actually in honor of my dad is a peacock feather, which it's kind of an inside joke because my dad was a bit of a peacock. And she planted a tree. She planted a tree that she thought he would like. So I think it's not to deny that we are sad and that we have lost, but I do think to the extent that we can draw our attention to something positive, then, it gets us out of the hole.
So we describe these things as we describe people who can do that as strong, and we worry about people who can't do it as weak. Your book actually speaks to the idea that we've kind of all got this in us.
I do think people are stronger than we think. And, what you said, Ali, about not feeling alone, like feeling if you're, when Michelle Obama said I think it was a podcast, or maybe she tweeted it, it was a couple months ago, she said, like, gosh, it's getting to me. I'm feeling a little depressed. I think there are a lot of people whose shoulders softened and thought, like, it's not just me. And I think that's very important. At the same time, I think we should realize that that we do have inner strength, and the vast majority of people actually are resilient. So resilience is actually the norm, not the exception.
Yeah. How do you deal with the idea that you can't dodge these feelings? After 9 months of this and maybe 6 more months of quarantine or some version of it to come, you can't dodge it. You can't avoid it. You can't pretend it's not there. And when you get these feelings of anxiety and loneliness and depression, you kind of have to hold the feeling. You have to kind of own it and know that in 20 years you'll talk about what it felt like in 2020.
Yeah, by the way, the mental time travel idea of like, what will I look back on 2020 as? What will the story be that I tell, depending on your stage of life, you might think grandchildren. I think it's actually very helpful, because one of the things that helps people manage negative emotions is actually temporal perspective. So that's the fancy schmancy psychology world. But basically, like when we have some distance in time from what we're experiencing, we can manage those emotions better. And you can even kind of do this yourself, not by removing yourself from 2020 right now, truly, but removing yourself from 2020 mentally and going into the future and saying, in 2040, when I look back, what will be, the story I tell, and what will I be proud to say about how I manage things?